Hello, I'm Halise Lieberman, Director of the Toby Center, and I'm very privileged to welcome you to today's session, organized in partnership with FASB. Tonight, we are joined by the Polish Vice Consul in LA, Paweł Lickiewicz, by our supporters, members of the Toby Center Scholars Advisory Committee, academic and institutional colleagues, and representative of our partner organizations here in Poland and around the world. Today's program will last approximately 45 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A session. If you'd like to leave a comment or ask a question, please do so, and we'll do our best to address it. Please also let us know where you are at this time. How did we come to this session? It stems from a conversation that I had with our moderator, Dr. Thorsten Wagner, about where we are when we need to start exploring different ways of remembering, learning, contextualizing, and reflecting on memorial sites and their current relevance to the world. Where are we today, and what do we need to address to make sure that the visits to memorial sites, learning about them, are impactful and make for change? It is now my pleasure to introduce a mentor, a colleague, and a friend, Dr. Thorsten Wagner of FASB, who has ignited this conversation and will take it further. Without further ado, Dr. Wagner.
Thank you. Well, let's first take the doctor away. It sounds good, but it would be claiming wrong feathers that I don't claim. But Elise, thank you so much for working with us, with FASB on this one. Let me just briefly say that I'm happy to lead the fellowships at Auschwitz for the study of professional ethics. That's what FASB stands for. And that's also what, of course, brings us together in this context. We've been lucky to be working together in other contexts before, thinking about what the future of dealing with a site like Auschwitz in the broader context of Holocaust education, of course, is. I would like to take a moment to introduce the two additional participants, panelists, if you want, that we will be able to talk with today. That's first Paul Salmons, who is a world-renowned curator and educator. I think the way that you phrase it on your webpage is of difficult histories, which I like as an approach. We know each other primarily because Elise started to call me a mentor. That's probably exaggeration, but to call you a mentor, I think, is very appropriate in terms of having been privileged to work with you in different contexts. You have been co-producing, co-curating the exhibit at the Imperial War Museum on the Holocaust. That, of course, was a very important step. Right now, you are the curator of the exhibition Auschwitz, that is or at least until recently has been seen in New York at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. I know that you've been working in the context of, I think, what now is called IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and many other contexts. And I'll perhaps come to other contexts where we had the privilege of crossing each other's paths. So thank you so much for participating today, Paul.
Thank you. Real pleasure to be here.
And I feel a bit wrong here because I have a Paul and I have a Pavel, so it's not just me who's kind of the outlier here. Pablo Savitsky is our third or fourth, if we count Lise in, person here. Also a friend, if I may say that, a journalist, a photographer, and an educator and guide at the State Museum at Auschwitz. And I've had the privilege of seeing you in action and working with you when we, with our fellows, have been visiting Auschwitz for many years and have seen your brilliance in terms of how to communicate a very complex and dark history of the Holocaust. You've been producing documentaries, publishing books, also photo books about Auschwitz. And I thought that it would be really beautiful just for us, the three of us, to have a chance to talk about how to deal with the site of Auschwitz and also to deal with it in the context of the broader issue of Holocaust memory and Holocaust education, when we in so many ways are at the threshold, both in terms of the fact that we move into an era where we will not have many survivors and witnesses around anymore. That number, of course, has been dwindling for a while and will continue to do so. Also, of course, that it's obvious that there is an increasingly global character. Just the fact that Paul works in London and New York and so on already indicates that. And for Pavlo's work reality, I think something similar could be said. So there's a global dimension to this, an increasingly global dimension to dealing with these topics. And then, as Helise, of course, already said, there is the issue that we all have been forced into some kind of hiatus, right, of not being able for a large part of 2020 and with some consequences for 21 to actually go to the sites, to the key memorial sites, museums that have to do with that history. I found it particularly interesting also to talk with the three of you, or with the two of you, because I think that as what we share is, of course, a thinking about the relevance and the impact of the Holocaust and also Auschwitz for the next generation, but we come at it, I expect, from very different angles, because Pablo, you are really anchored in the turf, in the site, in the actual physical surroundings of Auschwitz as what both has become a central site, but of course also a symbol of that history that we're talking about. And that's, of course, a tension we might want to address. And Paul, you in many ways, of course, for me, embodying one of the most sophisticated attempts to lift that to a meta level of thinking about how to educate this history, and to some degree being half independent of those specific sites, having worked in London, having produced exhibitions, and trying to help people in Europe and all over the world how to deal with this and similar stories. And I thought that would be for a start as a fruitful beginning, just to give you all an example of what this work of course looks like. I just want to start with at least for a moment showing you I think a beautiful site that gives us a good sense of that. I hope that you'd be able to see it here. So here you can see Pavel in action. This is a group of FASB fellows. I believe we are at what's called the Judenrampe, and I don't have a similar photo of you, Paul, but I thought that this might atmospherically give us a good sense of course, what educating about the history of the Holocaust on the ground, hopefully again the reality of 2021, will look like. I will stop sharing now. Where I would like to go in a moment is just to ask the two of you what 2020, early 21 has meant for you and for your work, how it has impacted you. But before I stop babbling, I'll just say what really makes me curious and what brings me also into this hour of conversations is that I'd be very curious in hearing from you guys how we can try to avoid that when we talk about Auschwitz and the broader context of the Holocaust, how we can try to avoid simply confirming people in the views they have already. So are there ways to question in a productive way, question and undermine the assumptions and the notions of people in a productive way? And the second big thing that I would like to just lay out right from the beginning is how do we deal with the gap, the threatening gap between, on the one hand, wanting to deal with Auschwitz and Holocaust education, but perhaps feeling uneasy about ending up to say, let's go to Auschwitz so that you learn that it's not okay to put the refugee center around the corner on fire or to be a bully in the schoolyard. So how do we deal with that gap between seemingly less monumental aspects and then this reality both of the Holocaust and also the specifics of Auschwitz? But let me first turn it to you, perhaps, Paul. What was 2020 like for you? Has your work continued? Have you been able to work? How has that kind of absence from the historical side affected you?
Thank you. And again, thanks for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to learning from you both and hearing from participants, their questions also. Yes, it's been an extraordinary year for all of us, hasn't it? And for many people, much worse, I think, than it has been for myself. I've been rather fortunate, I think, in terms of certainly, most importantly, my personal circle, my family are safe, friends have been safe. In terms of work, of course, we all felt very threatened, I guess, by the new situation and very felt that instability. and many people have really suffered. I've been fortunate, as I say, that my work has continued, although our exhibitions have at certain points been closed. The exhibition on Auschwitz in New York reopened in September, and visitors are safely coming to that exhibition. It will be there until May the 2nd in New York, and then it will move to Kansas in June this year. And we're also have just opened another exhibition called Seeing Auschwitz in San Sebastian. This is with Musealia in cooperation with Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. A smaller exhibition, but also, really quite well attended given the circumstances. Other aspects, though, we're working on a major new museum exhibition that will open towards the end of this year in the autumn in the United States. I can't say much about it at the moment, but that's been a challenge, of course, not to be able to be with the collections and exploring and investigating them in person, but we have been able to make use of digital technology, digital archives, and the team, again, the Musealia team that is far-flung. We have a colleague in Los Angeles, others are in Toronto, I'm in Brighton in the UK, others are in Spain or in Luxembourg. This technology, of course, allows us to come together, and we still have very intensive conversations. So yeah, we've been okay. Thank you.
Well, if you ask me, so personally, hopefully everything is okay, and the pandemic influences our life. As a father of two young boys, one in the nursery, one in the early years of the school, we discover new levels of parenting, different, deeper, more extensive, but sometimes more tiring as well. But in the professional life, a lot changed at the memorial. 161 days of the lockdown, 161 days the museum was closed for visitors, and this is an unprecedented situation from 1947. We are basically closed 3 days a year, and we have visitors all the time, and right now the site is almost empty. We reopened again in February, so for us it was a challenge on the institutional level as a lack of visitors, although of course the entrance to the memorial is free, but guided tours is an important source of our income to work. So we have to find our ways to struggle through this difficult time, not to lose our team, not to lose our guides. That's extremely important. So most of our regular educational work was simply put on hold, except some pre-planned investments, but educational conferences, research, this is, this ship is stopping, and it will take time to start moving it ahead, although of course we are working. We had to change the memorial to be ready to all the safety requirements or all the safety pandemic measures. Luckily, in our conservation team, we have an epidemiologist, which is not a usual situation for most of the museum, but so we could prepare all the regulations and also the system for visitors, including making more space in the exhibition, creating some lines for the guides and for the visitors, removing most of the documents from the exhibition because they are placed in horizontal displays, and not to allow people to come together close to see a document. We basically removed most of them. And many, many other things like that to be able to have visitors safely, and to do what is our mission, to educate about the story of Auschwitz in the authentic place. And we were thinking when we were planning this meeting, maybe I should speak from some real authentic space from one of the buildings, and I'm going to do a little... it wasn't so much planned, but of course I'm right now sitting in some kind of a little studio, and lots of the technical equipment is here that allows us to do broadcasts, and this is also something new for our work when we talk about reaching people online. But I am at the memorial, and I'm opening a window. It's 8:15 here in Poland, and this is what you see. You can see the site, and the site, one of the watchtowers, and the light here, and the fence. I'm in block number 12, upstairs, and So, and this is for us something very important. The authenticity is the key of our work, and not being able to show it to the people who come is very difficult. And something that is very paradoxical in these strange times is that those fewer number of visitors have now a slightly different experience of visiting the memorial, because in the recent years we had record numbers of people visiting, 2.3 million in 2019, and last year it was 500,000. This year, so far, a little bit over 7,000 people. So on one hand, this complicates the work of a very complex organism, that kind of a huge museum like we are. But for those people who come right now, the experience of being in a site that is relatively empty is a different experience of being in this authentic space. And although I wish the pandemic will end as soon as possible, probably some of this experience that people have right now, we would like to keep, and it's always finding a proper balance, because we want everyone to be able to see the site, but an authentic site is not made of rubber, and we cannot have everyone here. And I always say that on one hand, we can be extremely proud that over 2.3 million people did come and see in a given year the site, but on the other hand, several billion people didn't, and they will never. And maybe also the time of the pandemic turned us as the institution to those people with different projects that we started, with our social media activity, with some projects that we are going to start. So it is a changing time. And one thing I think I need to emphasize, that in all this turmoil of the pandemic and financial difficulties and so on, one thing continues to be safe and stable, which is the conservation of the site. The authenticity of the Auschwitz Memorial is safe thanks to the funding of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation, which is somehow independent also from these turmoils of the pandemics. So while the site was closed to visitors, our conservators kept working, and they are working all the time to make sure that all the post-camp objects, ruins, relics, documents, and everything that we used to work here, Paul uses in the exhibitions that we are also doing together. Thorsten, use when you teach all the faculty at FASP, all those different things that we also sometimes do together, that this authenticity is safe, and this is very important to us.
Thank you. Paul, I wonder whether you have been forced into working more in this kind of virtual space and also more distant from your normal kind of playing field of being able to be in the classroom physically, or training the educators, or being in the exhibits. How has that affected you in this context? And perhaps you can weave in this whole aspect of authenticity and what it means for you in this context.
Yes, I guess we all have to cope with the digital challenge, and to try and find new ways of continuing to explore this history and its meaning with others. So I've been doing some work with a colleague who's based in Austria, Wolfgang Schmutz, on issues around meaning making or participant-centered learning, and we've been able to develop, I think, some quite intensive approaches to conversations, online conversations with quite small groups, but using documents, using photographs, using also film of sites, and virtually being able to kind of create a space. So Zoom has been very good to us in that sense, and we are lucky, of course, that despite the pandemic, we're living in a time where this technology does make communication possible and does make it possible to continue the work. This turn towards the digital as well, it feels particularly resonant for me right now, and that I'm working on a new project for UNESCO and the United Nations with colleagues at University of Oxford, where we're beginning to map and explore try to better understand forms of Holocaust denial and distortion online. So that obviously is something which we do from our screens, and we are trying to conceptualize these ideas a little bit more firmly at the moment. And this research study, I hope, will reveal to us more of what's going on and help us to better understand. And out of that, we will create educational approaches and materials that will help educators to explore that kind of issue, those themes with their students. So with the rollout of the vaccinations, of course, we can focus on this kind of development work, perhaps more intensively than we might otherwise have done. So it depends how you use your time. But the authenticity of the site absolutely is something that we miss. And also the space, the pedagogical space of being together in a classroom is very different to being online, having these conversations, despite how productive they can be. The other aspect, of course, a big part of my work is in terms of the exhibitions, and we're very fortunate in our relationship with the Auschwitz Museum, the huge number of original artifacts that have been loaned to the travelling exhibition at Auschwitz not long ago, not far away. We have some 700 artifacts in that exhibition, and about half of them come from the Auschwitz Museum. That kind of tangible, authentic contact with the past, the fact that these remnants of the past, those things that people owned and they touched and they used, that they made and they threw away, these things of their lives that were there at the time, that we can now present sometimes for the first time to visitors. That authenticity of actually being with those objects and being able to examine them. You know, again, we try to make some of these available through online presentations, but there is a tangible difference, of course, between seeing it on screen and actually being present with that object itself.
Yeah. I mean, I must say that we, from the side of FASB, also have been trying, of course, to make the best of the situation, as particularly Pavel knows and Paul knows from some conversations. Our whole idea is, of course, to try to engage young professionals, whether they still are in the grad schools or just recently graduated, and allow them to confront themselves with the role of professionals in the Nazi years and the Holocaust, and then, of course, find a way to have a sharper analytical perspective on their own dilemmas of professional ethics. And that, of course, gives so much more sense when we were able to be in a classroom, in a different kind of setting, and then also to go to the sites of the perpetrators, whether that's in Berlin or whether that is, of course, very much also Auschwitz. What we've been trying to do is, of course, as everybody, I guess, to develop a series of webinars. And in some ways, of course, it gives also opportunities, right? So we are now preparing 2 different series of webinars, one called Rhyme of the Past, where we try to cater to some of these historical dimensions, but the second one then also dealing with our context being based in New York, to think about how the whole reckoning with racism in America, of course, creates a different kind of way of looking at the specific problems of European history and the role of professionals during the Holocaust. So in that sense, you could even say that us being forced into the Zoom world, of course, creates some opportunities, as I also hear the two of you talking about at the same time. Let me perhaps move us a little bit along in terms of the themes here. You both know that much better than I, but it seems to me as if Auschwitz as a site has become a very different place over the decades, and that has something to do with the fact that, one, of course, historians will probably talk about something called the Holocaust paradigm, right? A generation or two ago, people would talk about World War II in very different terms from today, where we read the 20th century, or at least World War II, through the lens of the Holocaust, and to some degree, of course, Auschwitz in there. Secondly, my impression is that while we can see Auschwitz as a place that very early on was a place for mass events, for diplomats and politicians meeting and visiting, as Pavel very often will welcome them, and then also taking them around, is of course something that started very early. And of course, very early on, Auschwitz also being a place for education, which all the three of us are interested in, but moving to a site of tourism, mass tourism, or what some people also critically call Holocaust tourism. And then, of course, perhaps as a third factor, it seems as if the shift, and I'm curious what you guys think about that, from a resistance paradigm, where for the first decades after World War II, in a Polish, but also in a broader context, of course, the focus was on the narrative surrounding resistance, a stronger focus on the victim paradigm was moved. So there are many, and probably more factors that changed it. And against that backdrop, I would love to hear the two of you perhaps sharing your thoughts with where that takes us in terms of how to make the history of the Holocaust and the history of Auschwitz relevant for today. What are your experiences? Where do you see the dangers, the pitfalls? And where would you like us to go in the next years?
If I may say just a few words, of course, this is a topic that is so broad, and I think our challenge in educating about Auschwitz is to make people's life complicated, and because people come to Auschwitz with different perceptions, but Auschwitz has become a symbol, and it is true that sometimes behind this symbolic idea of what Auschwitz was, there isn't much factual knowledge standing. People come here with some assumptions, and of course we get these questions that people come to Auschwitz I and they immediately ask, where's the rail line that I am supposed to see? Or they go to Birkenau and they search for Arbeit macht frei. But of course, this complexity is on a much different level, because people come with many different motivations, and some are there are still survivors coming, but there are second, third generations. There are people who come to Auschwitz more as a symbol of the Holocaust than many other things. There's people who come for whom Auschwitz is more the story of the Polish martyrology or the Sinti and Roma, or many other memories that Auschwitz as a memorial covers. I always say that in Polish we say the place of memory, but the language miejsce pamięci. Memory can be both singular and plural. And I think when you say a place of memories, it's much better. It talks what we are. And I think it's our challenge to draw people a little bit off from this kind of a path that they have, because Auschwitz is a symbol, and to start explaining them all those complexities. And I always repeat that on one hand, when we talk about the Holocaust, it is much more complicated than just the story of Auschwitz, because people do not see many other sides that are linked with the story of the Holocaust, starting with political developments in Nazi Germany, in Berlin and Nuremberg and Munich, and we are just approaching the anniversary of creation of Dachau concentration camp and many other things, and then occupation and Einsatzgruppen and many places there, and the development of the extermination camps. Auschwitz is the biggest of these camps, and in terms of numbers of victims, 1 out of every 6 victims of the Holocaust were murdered here, but it is a much more complex picture that people should at least try to understand. On the other hand, the story of Auschwitz is much more complicated than the story of the Holocaust, and the extermination of Jews, because here in this world of memories, we have the memory of Poles and also Polish Jews and Sinti and Roma from many countries, also Polish Sinti and Roma, and Soviet prisoners of war. And these are the 4 largest groups, but we can go down to smaller numbers. Paul remembers when we were opening the exhibition in Madrid, we tried to find all the people with Spanish origin that were in Auschwitz, and over 40 names were found. Or we have Edward Hamel, born in New York City, who was a football player in Ajax Amsterdam, who was murdered in Auschwitz. Or we'll have some Jewish women from the Channel Islands who were deported through Grand Sea to Auschwitz, or we'll have a Scottish nun, Jane Haining, and so on and so on and so on. And we need to try to address this when we try to explain people not how little they know about Auschwitz, but maybe they should have much more respect and this awareness that there is so many other boxes that they can open when they talk about the story. And of course, one thing that we can do to, as Thorsten, you said, how to maybe deal with those symbols that people come here with, is that our visitors are guided by people who are experts. And of course, they are prepared to tell a very general story of Auschwitz, how it developed from 1940 to 1945, and many other dates and facts in between. But what they can do is to build this narration to people that they talk to, using different elements of the story that people will be able to relate to make this relevant and make this an important educational experience. But one thing that is right now, I think, our huge challenge is how to take it from the level of memory, of facts, of some very basic information, through maybe a little bit more awareness of what does it mean, why did it happen, why was Auschwitz possible in the historical terms, and move it to the level of our today responsibility for the world. Auschwitz is, when people come here, it's a small educational trap, because people who come here see the victims, and this is, of course, the group of people in this story that they concentrate on, because we want to mourn the victims and we want to cry over those victims and we want to learn how they suffer. This is something very important, and our empathy goes towards the victims. We have perpetrators, and it is a much more complex issue, because people do not really want to talk about them and do not want to look at them as human beings then, because it would be much more difficult to look at us and them human beings in the past, and we are human beings, and what it makes for us as a more universal story of how people can become perpetrators. And they were not monsters, but these people are here. And there's the third group that is not so much present in the history of Auschwitz, and this is very natural, but they are present in this story, and they're present today, and most of our visitors are the bystanders. And there's this question, what did people do then? And it immediately comes to the question, and what do people do now? And this is the question of our responsibility, and we need to work hard, and this is our constant challenge, to address this, because the true understanding of Auschwitz is whether we, or people who visit, or people who participate in our educational programs, seminars, and so on, or people who follow us in social media, or people who will join us online in some kind of conference, the true understanding of Auschwitz is if we feel in us this increase of our moral anxiety and our personal responsibility, that we will try to think about the past and think about today, and that we are also responsible for building some kind of a better world, and how to use this warning and this very difficult, complex lesson in looking at the world today. I think the visit at the Auschwitz Memorial should make people uncomfortable also because of this, because sometimes people come with this issue, with this idea that they will leave a candle or put a stone or leave a flower or say a prayer, and then they listen to a guide for 4 hours and they leave this place and their job is done. And I think we need to try to put in this narration some kind of needles that will, or some pressure that will be uncomfortable, that maybe I should do something, because as today we ask this question, what did people do in 1930s, 1940s when it was happening? Why didn't they do enough? Why didn't the world do enough to help? There will be other people in 30, 40, 50 years who will be asking the same question about us today. And this is something which is a challenge. It is also a challenge because this should be some kind of a universal warning. It's not addressing individual cases and individual people, because naming one means that we will exclude others, and it's always a problematic, but building kind of a universal mirror of moral values and moral responsibility is something that that we are doing more and more, and we're thinking about doing more and more.
Thank you. Paul, would it make sense for you to try to pick up on this question about, which I think is more than half of what you're doing all the time, to try about the transfer into the contemporary context and how to do that in a meaningful and careful way. And then Pablo brought up a couple of other topics that you might want to comment on.
Sure. In that aspect of meaning making, from exploring a very complex, difficult emotionally challenging past. We need to be able to help our visitors both engage with and appreciate the scale of these crimes and the depths of inhumanity that the suffering of the victims, as Pavel said. But we need to be able to do this in ways that, of course, don't incapacitate them, and that they're able to bear this experience and to then move between a deep emotional engagement and also a kind of cognitive reflection on what these things mean. Within that space, it can be very easy, I think, for us to misappropriate the past and use this deep emotional experience for a form of kind of manipulation. If we're not careful, we can slip into a kind of preaching using the past for our own ends. And you can probably find within, I think Lawrence Sanger said, the kind of the rubble of the past, any kind of meaning that you want to take from it. So I think we need to be very careful, and I know Pavel is, because again I've had the privilege of going through Auschwitz with a group with Pavel, and I think being very careful not to impose our own meaning on this past. But as Pavel rightly said, I think to open up difficult and challenging questions and to confront our visitors, if it's a visitor to our exhibition or if it's someone who's coming to see the site itself, or indeed in the classroom, we need to be able to complicate people's picture of the past, to create a kind of dissonant space where there's a lot of common knowledge about the Holocaust and about Auschwitz. Some of it accurate, some of it rather informed by popular sources that maybe oversimplify that past. And I think at all these moments when we can we know from research, from good research, the kinds of myths and misconceptions that are rather prevalent, and we can plan for that. So we can use our limited time and our resources and the space that visitors give us to explore these issues, to confront them with the areas that will challenge what they think they know, and to do that in productive ways, not to make people feel ashamed or to feel foolish, but rather to be more curious. And I think one of the ways we make people curious is not to directly answer the questions that they pose. We can easily, again, slip in, for instance, in the classroom, people, genuine, sincere question from a young person, from a student about, why did this happen? How was this possible? That's where I think we sometimes move into, if we're not careful, again, what Pavel said of the lighting of a candle or having a kind of commemorative event that somehow is cathartic, and it might sort of slip into the kind of generalizations of, this is where hatred goes, or it all starts with words. None of these things really help us understand or explain these complex events. If we refuse to give that kind of pat answer, and we leave instead open the space, the good question, the intelligent, probing questions that our students and our visitors give us, and instead provide opportunities for them to explore the evidence from the past, to explore the kinds of interpretations, to share with them the sorts of thinking that the community of scholars has been working on for decades now, but with these very difficult open questions. And a friend and colleague of mine, Yuriv Lapid, I think, came up with a good guiding principle for what makes a good question. And he said, so a good question is one that we are genuinely struggling with ourselves. And I think this sort of, somehow, when we're dealing with these difficult pasts, there can be a sense of obligation and a duty of care to our students or our visitors that wants to make it okay for them and wants to give them a kind of satisfactory conclusion. But in a sense, we talk about the authenticity of the place. That seems to me to be an inauthentic pedagogical reaction, because if we're honest, I think most of us don't feel so certain about what these things mean. We also are deeply challenged, no matter how many years we've been struggling with this. And we should be open and honest about that, and I think engage our visitors and our audiences and our students with questions which allow them to explore different thinking, different ideas. And one of the key pedagogical principles here, I think, is not only do we share expert knowledge, whether that's the guide at Auschwitz or your historical research, Thorsten, or our curated exhibitions, but also that we allow them to be seen and be heard, and to reflect and to be open and honest. And I think a real challenge for us is also to create a space where people feel at ease sharing their thinking on these difficult and challenging and emotionally difficult issues, because it can be that in an environment like an authentic site or a museum or a classroom, that there is such a kind of hierarchical structure and intense expectations of what we should say or how we should think or we should behave, that actually a lot of things go unspoken. And I think that's not conducive to real learning. I think we need to be able to open up that space and exchange our ideas, and accept other people's alternative points of view.
Thank you. To move us on, I might just want to quickly share my screen again. I think what is really important for me is, and it has been in the past again and again, Paul, is exactly your article where you touch on some of these things, universal, I'm looking for the exact title here, where universal meaning or historical understanding. It's not so good when you start a sentence and you don't know how to finish it, which very much kind of made that point clear for me. There was a question a moment ago whether FASB also would take journalists on this trip, and I just quickly want to answer Evelyn Cantor's question, say yes, we both, for recent graduates, but also for people who've been working for a while, we do these studies. We work together with Pavel and with other partners in Europe to organize these kinds of trips. And this is also a good opportunity just to encourage everybody who would like to ask more questions and add to the discussion also here in the commentary. One point that I briefly wanted to bring up is, let me see if I can move this on. It's not as easy as I thought. Is of course to discuss the question of the perpetrators. What we are trying, of course, to do is by looking at a guy like Bernhard Lösner that you're looking at here, who was at the so-called Jewish desk in the Ministry of the Interior and ended up being flown to Nuremberg and writing the Nuremberg laws, or even other individuals like the engineers of the company that designed and built the crematoria in Auschwitz and other places, the Topf company. What we are focusing on, and I think that links in with what both of you said a moment ago, is of course how arguably you don't need to be strongly ideologically motivated to actually pave the way or be instrumental for the crimes. And that very often in that broader setting where society had defined itself by radical exclusion and decided that Jews are not part of the we, that very trivial and quotidian motivations of status, prestige, ambition could unfold and also become factors that would lead these engineers like Prüfer and Sander and the Topf brothers, or for that matter also the people in the civil service, to become part of these crimes. That is, of course, what we're trying to do, to focus on the roles of perpetrators that not necessarily are monsters, people that were ordinary Germans, and that I think that's a crucial point for us, perceive them themselves as morally intact. I think that's a crucial factor, that to understand how we can get to the situation of Auschwitz becoming this machinery of murder, that for Germany and obviously for many other European countries and their populations collaborating with the Germans, that there is this strong participation, and especially for Germans, also the sense of being part of a project where there's consensus surrounding it and that people identify with it. And that's, of course, the uncanny thing that is involved with that. I would like to use that as a bridge to ask the two of you, from we are coming from, FASB is, of course, to say we know there's a broad spectrum of what memorial sites should do. Pavel alluded to that, being the place of preservation and conservation, being the archive, being doing many different things, but also to try to ask the question, of course, of complicity, of enabling, of making that possible. And I wonder what your professional, personal takes are on that fine balance between commemorating the victims, which, of course, in many ways, in this competition with the resistance paradigm that I mentioned earlier, was key for many decades, and what people have been asking and demanding, and we, of course, see unfold increasingly for the last 10, 20, 30 years, and that's, of course, that sites of collective German, of Nazi collective violence become places of learning, of understanding, of trying to relate and connect to these crimes. Perhaps I can start with you, Paul. For me, what left deep impressions, just being able to profit from your teaching, was how you've been working with a shoe and have been trying to use something as presumably harmless as a child's, I think, a boy's shoe, which actually very much, if I'm remembering correctly, even was from the collections at Auschwitz, but I'm not sure about that part. And unfolding it from there. Is that one way to address some of these questions?
So that's that small shoe. Yes, it's in the Imperial War Museum collections, but was discovered at Auschwitz. So the activity is designed to help young people initially slow down and look more closely at evidence, and to try to examine what is it that we can reasonably infer about the past. We're looking at one artifact, one object here, but the same methodology, I think, can be applied to photographs or to written documents. And part of what we're trying to do in that kind of activity is to go beyond just the substantive knowledge, which, of course, that contextual knowledge is essential in order to be able to make sense of any historical source. So on one level, we are providing narrative around this activity, but we're also trying to expose students to the kind of disciplinary knowledge of how we know what we know about the past, and that can, by extension, also be about the world as well. So I think in that sense, what we're trying to share is what Michael Young has called powerful knowledge, in the sense of not only a narrative which is related and narrated, but that kind of epistemological understanding of a respect for evidence and a way of working with that. So that particular activity, that particular artifact, does very much focus on trying to understand something about an anonymous individual from the remnant, this small shoe that we still have with us today. And by extension, we can look at many aspects of the victims, but also the great crime of the Holocaust, and it's intended to stimulate a range of questions from the group themselves that they want to pursue. But your point also, Thorsten, as understood it, is around the move or the turn also towards the perpetrator. And one of the questions which emerges out of that discussion is very naturally, who would kill a 3-year-old child? Why would this happen? How is this possible? That opens up the possibility for us to bring in all sorts of other evidence, of course, and allow students to explore those very difficult and complex issues. And this move from a victim-centered narrative, or so I think I might have lost the connection for a moment there. This move from a focus only on the victims, and that's an essential focus. We need to, as Pavel said, to mourn and to commemorate and to acknowledge the humanity of the victims. But they can't answer our question of why and how this happened, of course. It wasn't the victims that did these things. It was the wider European society, and not just German society, of course. That complicity extends through all German-occupied Europe, through its allies, through its helpers, through its facilitators. And once we get into that, and also begin to look at this wide range of complicity at many different levels throughout society, I think we can start to move towards very difficult and important questions about how our society is constructed today as well, and how, in Zygmunt Bauman's terms, it's possible to be complicit in genocide at a distance. That the things that we do, the decisions that we take, the projects that we work on might seem a very small part and even quite far removed from great crimes and great injustice. But actually, when we start to look more closely at that, we can actually find our fingerprints on various crimes and injustices around the world. And that's an opportunity, I think, for an educational move as well, to reflect on our responsibility there.
Thank you.
The monument at in Birkenau says, "Let this place forever be a cry of despair and a warning to humanity." So the cry of despair is, of course, putting the victims on the first plan, and it's always going to be like this, because we simply commemorate all those people who suffered and who were murdered here. But when we ask this, as Paul said, this most important question, why? It is not actually the question about the victims, it's the question about the perpetrators. I mean, when you go through Birkenau, when you go along this here behind me, you can see the gate of Birkenau, and you go along the selection platform and then end up at the ruins of the crematorium gas chambers, and you listen about the process of selection and then how it was all designed and prepared. One thing that we cannot avoid touching is the rationality, human rationality of it all, that it was very carefully planned and designed to, when you look at the development of the extermination process in Auschwitz, you can see that the perpetrators were learning to make the process more and more efficient, with the key moment in the summer of 1944 when this ramp was completed and the extermination of Hungarian Jews, 420,000 people deported in 56 days. And when we look at this rationality, we need to address who are the people, why people can do something like this, and why they're not monsters, why they did monstrous things on behalf of the ideology that some of them believed more, some of them believed less, because again, we have different levels of perpetrators. But to again draw people away of this very simple, easy path, which is a trap, to dehumanize the perpetrators, to call them monsters, devils. Dr. Mengele is immediately the angel of death. And Dr. Mengele had a wife, and Dr. Mengele was a young doctor who believed he can make a difference. However, the ideology he believed this was a criminal, horrible one for many people who became his victims, and so on and so on. And also not to focus only on Mengeles and the icons, but go down to individual SS men. And I know that we are getting to the end of the time, but one part of the story here, the memorial, I think is very symbolic to this whole question that we could discuss further. The exhibition that is at the Auschwitz Memorial today, many of you saw this exhibition, many of people who are listening, because I even guided some of the participants who put it on chat. The survivors who created this exhibition in 1955 left an important part of this story away. When you go through this exhibition, you barely see the perpetrators, because 10 years after the liberation, they really didn't want to look at their faces. And we should understand this, and we should accept this, because it was too fresh. These faces for them is something completely different that these faces are, or these uniforms are for us today as people over 70, almost 80 years after these events. And they didn't want to place those faces in the exhibition. They concentrated on the victims and on the scale and with the piles of shoes and hair and suitcases and everything else that is in the exhibition. Right now, one of the biggest projects that is taking place at the Auschwitz Memorial is the changing of our main exhibition, which is the process for a few years. So in, I think, 7 years, you'll be able to see, or 8 years, you'll be able to see the final result of our work that has been going on for a number of years. And one thing that is going to be added to the exhibition, or one major topic that is going to be added, is the perpetrators and Auschwitz as an institution of a state. I mean, to show that Auschwitz is not an island, that it is in this whole network of many institutions of a modern state, and it all comes down to this one place, and so many people worked on many different levels to make it possible. And then studying their motivation, humanizing them, is also an important way to understand the suffering of the victims. And we cannot understand the dehumanization of the victims without looking at the perpetrators as human beings involved in this ideology. So this will be added to this core, because what we feel is this is what is somehow missing when we try to get to an understanding of what Auschwitz was. And I think when we try to get to this issue of moral anxiety and then the story of the perpetrators, people, we can show them with their dogs or listening to music or being, the Commandant Rudolf Hösse's fifth child was born here in fall of 1943. So he was a father for the fifth time when he was already the master of this huge concentration camp that he had created. When we look at the Höcker album photographs of SS men eating blueberries 30 kilometers away in the mountains while the Hungarian Jews were being murdered, these are so many powerful and challenging clashes of different layers, meanings, that we as educators need to do it in a respectful way in order to bring people that we educate to a much better and deeper understanding of the story.
Thank you. I think we have a few more minutes, and I'd like to go back to the questions that we've had in the comment section. Some of them we already touched upon. Some of them also brought us back to where we started, about how, of course, we are in a situation where the numbers of survivors are not so large anymore, unfortunately. But one that Jackie Feldman brought up, there is a reality of Auschwitz, of course, becoming a tourist place, is also the selfies as Auschwitz, and whether that whole question of how to use the place and how to take selfies, Jackie brought up. So I wonder whether one of you or both of you want to pick up on that.
So I seem to be a selfie person, I mean, in terms of talking about this. So I think we need to look at selfies in a much broader photography as a medium. Because not every photograph is respectful or disrespectful, and not every selfie is respectful or disrespectful. People come to places like this with many different motivations. And again, we could elaborate on this for hours. Some people come because of their relatives suffered here. Some people come here to study. Some people come here as tourists. Some people come here as a religious pilgrimage. And sometimes these motivations are mixed. And people take pictures. And this is the way we document our life. And today the social media tend to ask us to document our life even more in many different ways. But selfie isn't the new invention. I mean, I remember when I was a little bit younger and I traveled, I went to some place and I asked a person, can you take me a picture? It is kind of a selfie taken by someone else. And people want to be placed in this kind of experience, and they want to be documented and photographed. The question is whether a selfie is made with this motivation, and then it doesn't bother me so much, although in terms of aesthetics, it may be something always problematic. But if people live in the world where selfie is a natural way of communicating, and you come to this place and you do it with this very respectful motivation, and people, when they post it on Instagram or Facebook or somewhere, they very often leave a caption, and for them it was a moving thing, and this was the only way they could, they know how to express this. But sometimes selfies are taken to make a joke, to be disrespectful, to do something awful, and here is kind of a border that I'm looking for. Because I could give you many examples of pictures made with super quality, and these are not selfies, that are done in order to distort history or to be disrespectful to the memory. So I think it's always important to understand a broader context. Maybe not encourage people, and we also understand that people come to the Auschwitz Memorial as another museum. Of course, we try to make them aware that this is not a museum, that this is a much more complex place. But you have a museum selfie day. You have all the other institutions that encourage you to play with the camera and your phone and how you look at reality with the devices we have. So we shouldn't go very easily to saying black and white. Everything here is probably much more complex when we deal with that, and therefore we need to make people aware that not every picture taken here, not every behavior will be seen by others. Now, I have much bigger problem, just to end it, when people take pictures when they balance. Again, I raise my computer to, you have these rails in Birkenau, and people take pictures walking on one of them, balancing. And here I find it very difficult to find an excuse. Why are you doing this in a place where 500,000 people were brought on this run? And do you really understand where you are that you want to have a picture like this? So here you will find different ways to address this, but there are many behaviors that we should try to understand. We should be critical when it is disrespectful, but we shouldn't put everything into one yes or no, black and white answer.
Thank you. Elise, can I ask another question from the list here? How are we doing with time-wise?
Well, we can indulge. Thank you, all of you. I think we have time for one short question. I want to tell all of those in the audience that we're really pleased that you're here. We will share your questions with the panelists. We will also keep them. We all, between FASB and the Toby Center, we offer a lot of different resources, and we're happy to help you address them. Let's just go to one more quick question, and unfortunately I think we'll have to wrap up, but I do hope we'll meet again. So Thorsten, one more question.
One that I found interesting was, I think it was from Dan Arroy, and perhaps this should be for Paul, if you feel addressing it, what the role of artistic expressions in literature could be in terms of creating a learning environment. I'm trying to find it right now, but oh, perfect. Thank you, Jakub. Is that something you work with? Do you see that this is perhaps even getting more important?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. I guess in some, without it being too long, I think I would probably fall back on some of the things I agreed with Pablo in his last answer. It's going to depend on what kind of literature, what kind of artistic representation, its purpose. I think one of the things that art is intended to do, of course, is to provoke and to try and make us think in new ways. So I think I have as much problem with kitsch, if you like, the kind of or a kind of lachrymose kind of response, one which is maybe unintentionally trivializing. Maybe I find that more difficult, less interesting than something which is maybe a little bit more on the edge of, or pushing the boundaries of our conversations. So I think one of the things which is important here is to, of course, carefully distinguish between the fiction, if you like, of a certain work, and to understand what it is trying to do. I think many people disagree, but I was more comfortable with something like Life is Beautiful, even though many people disliked it. I thought it was an interesting film. It just wasn't really a film about the Holocaust or about Auschwitz. I found it a beautiful kind of fairy tale about a father's relationship with his son. It had some kind of fictionalized context which appeared to be something to do with the Holocaust, but really I think very few people watching that would really believe that that was what the Holocaust was like. So I don't see it difficult or challenging in terms of memory or understanding, whereas something like The Boy in Striped Pajamas, I think, kind of pretends a little bit more to be accurate. It kind of gives the impression somehow of a greater kind of veracity, and I find that intellectually dishonest, and I find that a very problematic text, partly because of its, or mainly because of its inversion. People in the chat were asking about the de-Judaization of the Holocaust as well. It seems to me that this is a kind of inversion where people want their Holocaust without the Jews. And the only real Jewish character in it, the little boy Shmuel, is a kind of literary device to get the non-Jewish boy into the camp. This is deeply problematic, I think. I have more of a problem with that than I would with some other kinds of fictions, literature, or artistic representation. But this is very subjective, right? Many people would radically disagree with those statements, and that's an interesting point where we can engage and have an open sharing of thoughts and ideas. It's not black and white.
So before I give things back to Elise, I'll just say thank you for this wonderful conversation from my side, and perhaps just close on one thought, and that is why this was so important for me to talk with you. And thank you, Elise, for inviting me and being part of this. Is that for me and for working with FASB, of course, we have Auschwitz in our name, and we have that for a reason, because we believe that that's an extremely important site for leaders for the future, whether it's Europe or America or other places in the world, to think about what kind of influence and what kind of power and what kind of responsibility they have. And but that being said, our big challenge is, of course, that there's a danger taking somebody to Auschwitz, because it seems as if we are addressing history from its end result, right? So the big challenge, of course, I believe for all the 3 or 4 of us, is how can we see that as a process, and how can we see what kind of strands of individual and social behavior brings us there? How can I both be at Auschwitz and learn about and think about what kind of society wants Auschwitz and what kind of path and steps lead us there, whether it's the perpetrators, the complicit people, the enablers. On that thought, Elise, thank you so much. I'll hand things back to you.
First of all, Thorsten, Pavel, and Paul, thank you for your inspiring challenges. I think that what came out of this is only the beginning of many other conversations that need to take place in such fora, not only on Zoom, but God willing, soon in person, not only here in Europe, but obviously around the world, wherever we are. You have articulated challenges which need to be articulated, and I think you helped us understand how important synergy among those of us who are concerned with this field, who are educators, who are guides, who are historians, whether we're working through exhibitions or education, whether we're talking about ethics, that we need to work together. And clearly we've come to a time in history when we need to rethink, we need to reimagine, we need to reconstruct, so that what we want to transmit is actually transmitted. I want to thank all of you for joining us. We know you have many options for Zoom and other webinars, and we're delighted that you decided to join the Toby Center. We hope that you'll join us again on April 20th. Please know that this program is made possible by you as our audience. And if you would like to support this program, information on how you can contribute will be available in a follow-up email. Again, I want to thank Thorsten and FASB, Pavel, and Paul. And I look forward to seeing the 3 of you again, and all of you. In the meantime, we wish you very meaningful Passover celebrations of freedom. Freedom is both a responsibility and a privilege, as we've articulated tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.